I'd like to call this meeting in the State Board of Higher Ed. Let's start. Christy, let's call the roll. Here.
Sit. Dr. Melliker?
Here.
Mr. Shaft? Ms. Hoffer?
Shaft, here.
Okay.
Here.
Mr. Morton?
Here.
Dr. Murphy?
Here.
Mr. McEwen?
Here.
Ms. Reichert?
Here.
Mr. Ness?
Here.
Okay, our first item of business is to approve the agenda. The agenda does not contain any reports today, so the students, faculty, staff, Zach, Fernando, and Emma are off the hook. And presidents, I like this setting that we have with you right there, but you're off the hook a little bit today too, unless somebody has something, we'll have it open for public comment later on. But we appreciate the year that you finished probably today and yesterday, and your graduations are this weekend. I think there's going to be a board member at every one of your graduations, so we're anxious for that. But thank you for your year, and thank you for your attendance at these meetings. I like this setting, and even though we could turn it around, have the cameras facing that way, so that you guys would be the center of attention, but we'll take you off the hook a little bit. But thank you for your work this year. It's been great. If I could have a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved. Second.
Motion and a second to approve the agenda. Any questions? Any comments? Yeah, we do have one item on the agenda that we're going to add. It's the funding pool. We'll label that as 6A, and will be on the bottom of our board business. So there is an item that we're going to add. It's the funding pool performance core campuses. Okay, Christy, call the roll.
Dr. Melliker?
Yes.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft, vote yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Board Chair Jelmstad?
Yes. And then we have the approval of the minutes from our last two meetings. We had a conference call and a meeting on March 26th. If we could do those together, is there any questions? Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So move.
Moved by Kevin.
Second.
Second by Mr. Ness.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Dr. Melliker?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft, vote yes.
Board Chair Jelmstad?
Yes. Okay, the next item is the board business, and it deals with going into executive session. If we could have a motion to that extent. Okay, Chris?
I move to meet in executive session pursuant to North Dakota Century Code sections 44-4-19.1 and 44-4-19.2 for the purposes of attorney consultation and discussion of negotiation strategy and providing negotiating instructions in connection with potential settlement of pending litigation, specifically those cases involving the December 2009 collapse of Menard Hall, a building located on the campus of North Dakota State University. An executive session necessary to protect the bargaining position of the State Board of Higher Education in these cases. The executive session shall be limited to members of the board, including the faculty advisor to the board and the staff senate advisors of the board and board support staff, the NDUS Chancellor, Chief of Staff, and General Counsel for Fargo, NDSU President, Vice President of Finance Administration, Budget Director, Facilities Management Director, and Litigation Attorney, and Executive Assistant to the State Board of Higher Education.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Martin. Okay, Christy, call the roll.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft, vote yes.
Dr. Melliker?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Board Chair Jonestead?
Yes. We will take a short executive session, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and when we reconvene, we will take the appropriate action following the executive session. Board members, we can go.
Are we needing to call back in, or are we just staying in this room?
Call back in.
Call back in.
Does somebody have a number for that?
I'll resend it to you, Grant.
Yeah. Christie's going to send you the
Okay.
number. Okay.
Have her text.
Okay, we're reconvening from our executive session, and I'll call on Chris Wilson to summarize our session.
Can you hear me any better?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I just want to give you a quick update with regard to the Menard settlement. As you know, we asked for authority on March 26th to settle all three litigations associated with the Menard case. We did conduct an extensive mediation on August 6th with all the parties that were associated with this litigation. Although we did not achieve a universal settlement on that day, we did in fact settle one of the three litigations associated with that case, and that's the case of Grants Mechanical versus NDSU. In that case, Grants Mechanical was a contractor on the Menard project, and they alleged that NDSU owed approximately $450,000 in additional compensation. NDSU asserted that it only owed approximately $140,000 in additional compensation. As a result of the mediation, we did reach a settlement with Grants Mechanical in the amount of $220,000. And that is, I believe the last administrative details are being worked out, are being handled on that one. But for all intents and purposes, that case is completed at this point. And we settled that case based upon the authority that was granted to us at the March 26th meeting. And pursuant to the authority there, we are continuing the mediations, or we've continued to have consultations and discussions with the other parties, and that's why we went to executive session for this meeting in order to update you on the mediation and to seek continuing authority to settle the cases. And as a result, what I'd like is if a member of the board could make a motion to grant NDSU the authority to settle the remaining litigations associated with the Menard case in accordance with the authority that we discussed in the executive session.
So moved.
Okay, I entertain a motion. Carrie?
Oh, no. I would move to authorize counsel for NDSU to resolve the pending Minard Hall litigation in accordance with the board's discussion in executive session.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Okay, Christie, call the roll.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft, vote yes.
Dr. Melliker?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Ms. Nesset?
Yes.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Board Chair Jelmstad?
Yes. Thank you, Chris. Okay, moving right along, we call on Laura Glott to bring us an update on the budget guidelines. Laura?
Good afternoon, members of the board. First, I'll yield to the chair of the Budget Finance Committee to say if he'd like to make any introductory comments.
In the interest of time, I'll yield back to you, Laura.
Okay, thank you. He wants to get to the airport, so that means speed it along. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, on page 5 of your agenda packet begins the discussion about the annual budget guidelines. And thank you for rescheduling your meeting to earlier in the month to accommodate some decisions on this issue. As you know, we have to get annual budgets done and in place before the start of the fiscal year on July 1, so our timelines are rather short. So your change in dates is very helpful, and we're appreciative. Before I jump into the annual budget guidelines, I'd like to just take you to pages 22 and 23 of your agenda packet, just to provide a little backdrop about the differences that you'll see between campuses as they work through the annual budget process. And what pages 22 and 23 are is just a quick summary, end of the legislative session summary of our general fund appropriation. And if you look at page 22 and you go to the bottom of that page, you'll see some boxes in color. And if you focus on the very left-hand side of that, which is the final legislative appropriation as it relates to the 11 campuses and our office primarily, you'll see that our permanent base funding increase as a system was an increase of about 8.5% over the current biennial appropriation. So certainly we did very well in terms of legislative appropriation, and we're appreciative to the governor and the legislature for that. But the point I want to make more specifically is on the next page, page 23, and that is the impact by campus varies greatly across the university system. So if you only look at the aggregate numbers, it looks like everybody did really well. But what you'll see on page 23 when we look at the bottom line is that some campuses are actually up and will have additional funding, some will have significantly less. And so as they plan for their annual budget, as we move into that item, the impacts institutions differently. Again, on page 23, if we go down near the bottom of the schedule, and I'm going to focus on the orange line, line 26. And I'll just use BSC as an example in column 1. But if you look at the base funding increase that BSC received, and out of that, remember that campuses will have to fund the annual salary increase, the health insurance increase, and utilities from that funding increase. After BSC funds those out of their general fund increase, they will have about $1.2 million in general fund dollars remaining that they can use for other purposes. Now, if you follow your finger across that row, you see that some campuses are in actually a net negative position after they fund salary increases, health, and utilities. So Williston, for example, is short $3.5 million. UND is short, Dickinson, and then while the others are net positive, some are pretty close to break even, some actually have some additional dollars. So again, very different impacts by institution. If you then look at lines 27, 28, and 29, you've heard us talk about state student shares, that the state picks up part of the cost for salary, health, and utilities, and then students are expected to pick up part of the cost from tuition rate increases. Well, what line 27, 28, and 29 show you is that student share. And it assumes that on line 28, nobody has more than a 2.5% tuition rate increase because that's what was prescribed at the end of the session. So again, as you run your finger across the blue line, you'll see that some campuses don't generate enough tuition revenue from a 2.5% tuition rate increase to pick up that student share. What that means is they're going to have to find the money elsewhere in their budget. And so for some campuses, they end up short on the state piece. They also end up on the short on the student piece. And so cumulatively, for some institutions, those get to be rather large numbers. So I just explained that by way of introduction before we jump into the annual budget discussion. So if I could then take you back to page 5, which is the summary of the annual budget discussion, and we went over this in detail with the Budget Finance Committee, and this is before you today with their recommendation for approval. And I'll just try to quickly summarize, primarily focusing on number 3 on the background piece on page 5. As you know, of course, the legislature appropriates funds to us on a 2-year biennial budget cycle. And historically, what the board then has done is it has required each campus and each entity within the university system to essentially take that 2-year general fund appropriation, break it into annual periods, and then also in that annual period prepare a budget that addresses all other sources of funds, tuition income, grants, contracts, auxiliaries, investment income, so that when the campus is budgeting on an annual basis, it's a comprehensive budget. As I note here, the annual budget lasts for the current fiscal year was about $1.35 billion. If you add in capital, we were closer to $1.7 billion a year, all sources of funds. Only about 1/3 of that actually comes from the state general fund, so 2/3 of it is self-generated. While the board doesn't have constitutional authority to move money between institutions once those appropriations are set by the legislature, you have traditionally used the annual budget process as a way, though, to establish priorities for campus investment. If there are certain areas you'd like campuses to invest in, this is kind of your point in time to try to prescribe those as the campuses go back to work. So if we look at the bullets at the bottom of page 5, and again, I'm just going to highlight the major components of your decision today, and there's more detail attached. But the major components is first the annual salary guideline. As you might recall, the legislature built into the overall university system funding increase, as they did for state agencies, funding equivalent to a 3% annual salary increase. So what we're recommending to you today is that campuses build into their planning assumptions a minimum average 3% salary increase for employees starting July 1. And I want to make the fine point that that's a campus average. That does not mean it's across the board that every employee get a 3% increase, but instead some may get 4, some may get 2, but on the average no less than a minimum of 3% for the institution as a whole. The second bullet would be that as the campuses prepare their budgets, that they look to make investments in strategic areas that align with the board's strategic plan goals. And those are outlined on page 7, but they're around 4 cornerstones: the delivery of degrees that are the best value in the nation, provide programs people want where and when they need them, equip students for success, and maximize the strengths of the unified system. The third bullet then deals with tuition rate increases for the 15-16 academic year. And again, as you know, the legislature in the final legislation prescribed a 2.5% tuition rate limit each year of the biennium, unless an exception is approved by the budget section. So there is an opportunity to go to the budget section. We're not suggesting that in today, but to keep that in mind. And then they also accepted from the 2.5% limit the School of Medicine. So you'll see as we talk about the School of Medicine, they're a little bit different, but the legislation provides for that. What you'll see in that third bullet is that we have three institutions that are actually before you today with less than a 2.5% tuition increase. That's BSC at 1.9, Lake Region at 2%, and NDSU at 2.4%. The reason for that is under that state student share calculation, that's all of an increase those three institutions need to cover their student share. So they don't need more than that, so they're not asking to go beyond that up to the 2.5% cap. The School of Medicine actually needs 3.7% in the calculation, but they're coming to you today saying, we think we can live within a 3% tuition increase. So they're actually at less than what they could ask for. All of the other institutions in this proposal would be at a 2.5% increase. That is less than what they need. So again, going back to that schedule and that blue line, at 2.5%, most of the other campuses are going to end up with a shortfall in terms of their tuition revenues, and they'll just have to find another way to address those. And then the other thing I should just mention, and those of you that were on the board last year may recall this, last year the board had actually approved a 2-year plan to bring Williston State's tuition rates more in alignment with the other 2-year campuses. And that meant about a 7% annual tuition rate increase last year and this year. Well, obviously, with a 2.5% legislative cap now, we can't implement the second year of that increase at Williston. So I just point that out for those of you that remember it, that that's off the table in terms of the tuition rate discussion. And then the last bullet at the bottom of page 5 is under current board policy, the board has largely given the fee-setting authority to presidents or the chancellor. However, last session or the session before, I forget, the legislature imposed a requirement that said if mandatory student fees go up by more than the equivalent of 1% of a campus's tuition rate, then the board has to approve the fee increases. We have a situation at the bottom of page 5 where Williston State's fee increases are proposed to go up substantially more than 1%. So that's why they are before you today as part of this agenda item asking for board approval on their fee increases. All of the other campuses' increases are within that 1% limit, which means that the presidents can approve the fee increases. So at the bottom of page 5 in the last bullet, you'll see that Williston State is actually proposing a $708 increase in their mandatory student fees. And following on to the top of the next page, you'll see then that their fees would increase from $1,077 to $1,785 per year. And in a moment, I'll describe for you what's causing that change. But the important point to keep in mind is at the top of that page in that while it's a significant increase in fees, first of all, it was supported by the student body, and that's detailed in the narrative. But secondly, as you might recall, Williston State is put in place a new scholarship program beginning this fall due to a large contribution they've received through the foundation. And it's a scholarship for Williams County High School graduates. So essentially, any Williams County High School graduate that enrolls at Williston would qualify for a $6,500 per year tuition fee and book scholarship. So for at least the Williams County High School graduates, The fee increase would be covered by an offsetting scholarship. So out of pocket, those students really won't experience any fee increase. And that's about 50% roughly of Williston State student body. The other 50% are non-Williams County High School students. They also will see increased scholarships because of this new scholarship program. Existing scholarship dollars will be freed up from Williams County students. Those can be reallocated to non-Williams County high school students. So again, the other 50% will see some offsetting scholarship to those fee increases. It may not be 100%. So certainly some of the students will see a fee increase, but again, scholarship dollars will be available to help most, if not all of the students at Williston State, up to 100% for some of them. In order to describe why the $700 fee increase, you'll see 4 items listed at the top of that page. $209 of it is associated with an increase in their college fee, which is to support largely parking, repair, and maintenance. And of course, the parking lot at Williston State College is used rather heavily, including for athletic and community events. And then it's also to help support athletic operations. The activity fee would increase $71. And again, in large part, that's to help cover inflationary costs to support student activities and intramurals. The recreation fee would increase from $120 to $420 per year. I know all of you are aware of the fact that the Williston Park District opened a beautiful health and wellness center on the campus of Williston State College. What this fee increase does, it is essentially provides full student access to that facility so that the students pay no additional user fees. So this isn't unlike health and wellness centers that we've built and manage on our own campuses, and students pay a membership fee for use of those facilities. The only thing different in the case of the Williston situation is Williston State doesn't own and operate the facility. So essentially, Williston's collecting this money from the students, turning it over to the Park District, and then students have full access to the Health and Wellness Center. And then the last piece is an increase of $127 in their technology fee. Historically, the open source learning management system that has been used on campus has largely been supported only by distance ed students. But as we find more and more across all of our campuses, technology now is embedded in every course, including traditional on-campus courses. So the thought process here is that really all students should be helping to support that technology cost, not just distance ed students. So that's it in a quick summary. I do want to just point you to one other schedule, and that is on page 16. And what this does for you, if you look to the far right-hand column, columns 15 and 16, is when you look at a typical undergraduate North Dakota resident student who lives on campus, this outlines for you what cost increases that typical student would experience, taking into account tuition, fees, room, and board. And so you can see in columns in 15 and 16, both the dollar amounts and the percentage increases. They vary from, 2.5% at the low side to almost a 24% increase at Williston State. But again, keep in mind that at Williston State, we have not net out of these figures the scholarship dollars. So those aren't necessarily net prices. But again, you know, this is for the traditional on-campus student, and I think it just gives you a good overview of all the moving pieces because, you know, in our discussion today, we're really only dealing with tuition, but obviously fees are moving at the same time as our room and board rates. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I would stop there and members of the Budget Finance Committee may have other things to add from their discussion.
The only thing that I'd add is that Williston also uses the facility not only for health and wellness, but they also use it for a lot of their academic programs. So when you look at most wellness centers, it's a little bit more that their students pay towards that, but it does offer a lot more use and a lot more flexibility in the wellness center. And it's been, as Laura brought that up, and I think Ray did as well on the conference call, it has presented a lot of opportunities for that college, which has been great.
Grant, anything to add? I would just add that the students did vote in favor of this also. And from a capital spend standpoint, it's not too bad a deal for us.
Any other comments or questions?
I did have a brief question, and this was also from a student that I was talking with. There were some institutions, not all, but some that had a surplus above the state share, as well as a student share. And the student I was talking to was wondering in terms of whether this money could potentially be reinvested to lowering tuition, or what was the process for the case, you know, for evaluating what is done with the surplus, especially to lower student costs.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, so really we only had 3 campuses that needed less than a 2.5% increase. So really that would be the only 3 campuses we're potentially talking about here, because the rest would actually have shortfalls. From the perspective of those 3 campuses, you know, I think what we tried to do was honor the funding formula model, which really applies those state student shares. And as a result of that, those 3 campuses had no interest to go to 2.5% because it wasn't necessary. And so I think, you know, obviously for those 3 institutions, those are fairly conservative tuition rate increases when you look at what's happening nationally. And certainly there are other pressures on other parts of the budget for those other resources as well. So, you know, I think it's always a fine balance between reducing or maintaining affordability with quality. And, you know, how do you appropriately balance those two for the best interest of the student? So I'm guessing they're going to focus those dollars on how do we help maintain quality and protect our physical assets, because that was the other thing I forgot to mention as we were going through the impact by campus. One of the things you can't see in the numbers yet because it's not evident is that the legislature also this time required that in order for us to spend our regular repair and maintenance money, campuses now have to match it 2-for-1. So, you know, before they can fix the roof, the $100,000 roof repair, they have to bring $200,000 in other fund sources to match that. And that's difficult doing from private funds, because usually nobody's really thrilled about giving private funds to fix the roof. And so they're really going to have to look at how they're going to reallocate other dollars within the budget to come up with that match. And for some institutions, that's where they're going to find their match, from those additional state dollars that they may have gotten. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to access those repair and replacement dollars.
Any other comments from board members? Kathy?
I do. Why should that go on the students? Why are we talking fee increases on students? I'm so concerned about students being burdened with fixing the roof. I'm very concerned about this, and I'm concerned about doing a fee increase on the students.
Laura, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and I apologize if I've confused the conversation. So Williston is the one with the fee. When we say fees, I'm never sure if we're talking fees or tuition. So Williston is the campus here today with the fee increase, and you're correct. Part of their fee increase, as we said earlier, is being driven in part by needing to make parking lot repairs. But then secondly, on the tuition side of the house, I don't want to leave anyone with the perception that we're increasing tuition in order to come up with those match dollars we need to access those repair and replacement dollars. Essentially, campuses are going to have to either find those match dollars within their general fund budget, or they're going to have to find them from private sources or someplace else. But really, the tuition increase calculation we've got before you today is just necessary just to fund 3% salary increases for employees who are not paid from state general funds, so all of the folks that work in our residence halls and our food services and those kinds of operations, and then to pay their health insurance increase and their utility cost increases. But the repair and replacement funds are going to have to come from other sources of funds for that 2-for-1 match. So I'm sorry if I confused that conversation. But it is a point well taken about, what students should and shouldn't pay for.
Oh,
Okay. Laura, my question is, you have on page 16, we have the aggregate fees, tuition, and anticipated room and board for North Dakota residents. What does that look like? Do we have that same figure? Is that the next page for non-residents? I'm just curious if we have a similar set of figures for non-residents.
Madam.
And alternatively, and an add-on is, my question is, how many of our students who come into North Dakota institutions as a non-resident are permitted to switch to residency status? So it's sort of two questions, but they're actually intimately tied together.
Mr. President, members of the board, first, there isn't a particular schedule in here that focuses on non-residents, but the only thing that would be different for non-residents on page 16 would be column 8, the tuition column. So, I probably I'll do the math in our head, but we have different rate categories depending on your non-resident status. So, for example, our Minnesota rate is set by reciprocity. That's 112% of the resident rate. We have a number of students that come to us under compacts, the WICHE and the MEC compact from the member states. They come at 150% of the resident rate. And then we have what's called the true non-resident rate, which is 267% of the non-resident rate, but we don't have a lot of students in that category. Most of the non-residents are coming to us under a compact rate of 150% or a reciprocity rate of 112%. But then the room board fee rates would be the same. We don't price differently between residency status. Then with regard to your second question about how many come to us under, reframe the question for me again, I forget.
How many students enter our institutions as
and
non-resident
then change to
and then
resident
switch
status?
their residency status?
I don't know that number off the top of my head, but obviously in order to do that, they have to meet the statutory definition of a resident student. So we don't make that change until they've brought us sufficient documentation and evidence that they now meet all of the statutory definitions for resident tuition purposes. But I couldn't tell you, what percent over the course of their career switch from one category to the next.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I have just a couple of comments. I think I've brought this up before, but just with the minimum salary increase, I think it's absolutely important that, our pay keeps up, that we're paying competitively, that we don't fall behind. At the same time, I think by setting that floor, I understand it's an aggregate number, so one person may get none and one person may get 10%. By setting that as a floor, I feel like we are tying up some of these funds that if some of these institutions have perhaps been aggressive over the past couple of years with salaries and they don't need the funds in that particular piece of their budget within their labor budget, tying them there and not giving them flexibility to use those elsewhere as needed for operations, I think is, I don't know that I'm comfortable as a board member saying that I know their budget's well enough to say, yeah, you got to do 3%, that's what you need. For some it may be 4%, for some it may be 2%, I don't know that. And so I'm, while I like the idea of saying we have a target of 3%, because that's probably what all the World at Work and all of them are saying, I feel like we should have some flexibility, and perhaps this is something that all of the presidents have agreed on. Similarly, along those lines with the tuition cap, I mean, I realize that the legislature has said 2.5%, and that there's a couple that don't need that for the cost to continue. And I think I feel like I've said this before too, but when we talk cost to continue, that's cost to continue, and doesn't really address any new initiatives that we may have to provide education more, provide a better quality of education. And I think that if I guess I would like to be able to say that if any of our institutions have initiatives or particular programs that they want to pursue or different things they'd like to do on campus, and even though they don't need that just to continue, that they have some flexibility to come back and ask to go up to the 2.5% if it means that as a result of that we are doing things better on campus. So those are just kind of my two comments on us setting specific targets or numbers in there where we may not need to.
And Mr. President, members of the board, if I might just, on the first issue, I think you raised the question about whether the president supported the 3%, and the answer to that is yes. I think it's fair to say, and they can speak individually, that while some campuses have really tried to make a concerted effort to move salaries forward, we still have significant gaps in a number of areas. So, 3% is probably the bare minimum. There was some discussion early on about whether or not every campus could afford 3% because of the way the numbers play out. But again, I think the cabinet consensus was that this is just such a high priority in terms of recruitment and retention of staff that they needed to find the money to do it.
Terry, Mike.
Okay, Mike?
This is for Laura or maybe committee members. On the Williston situation, quite a large increase there. Was there any discussion about making that an optional fee for the rec center rather than mandatory? Half of them will receive that with the Williams County scholarship. How about the others? Was that a concern with the committee?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I don't believe that the Budget Finance Committee specifically talked about that, and I'm guessing President Nadolny's on the line and probably can respond to that. But certainly, this is part of the mandatory fee increase, which means all students pay for it. And Williston would not be unique in this situation, that there are many fees that students on all campuses pay that they don't necessarily take advantage of the associated service. But in order to keep the cost reasonable for everybody, it becomes a mandatory fee increase for everybody. So certainly as part of the activity fees on campuses, students have access to sporting events at no cost many times. How many students actually participate in the events. But again, in order to try to make it part of the campus culture and encourage students to participate, the same with a health and wellness center, that you're being provided it, certainly you're paying a fee, but then you have access, trying to encourage student participation and trying to keep it reasonable for everybody. It's just a fee that's spread over the entire student body. If we start asking students which fees they want to pay for and which they don't, we probably know the answer to most of that, and we probably wouldn't be able to offer a number of those opportunities to students.
I would also point out that a lot of the fees, most of the fees, it seems like there is a student vote.
Right.
I would, in response to Kathy's concerns, and that's a legitimate concern across the country, we did have a funding model in the last biennium that everybody agreed to, students, legislature, everybody, that the students would pay a certain percentage and the state would provide a certain percentage. Well, that didn't survive this biennium. There are legislators that feel that faculty are overpaid, that some faculty are overpaid. There are legislators that feel that there's fat in the budget. That may or may not be the case. Those are issues that we have to grapple with as a board. I keep coming back to the marketplace, that if tuition gets too high, the market will dictate. The students won't enroll. And when we see record enrollment at many of our campuses, record enrollment gives you pricing in the private sector. If you've got tremendous demand, you have pricing power. When they quit coming, then you've got to take then. But right now, the market is saying that I think the market is saying, with the enrollments that we're seeing at many of our schools, is that we're not out of line. That's my thought.
Janice?
Someone mentioned about the salary increases for the 3%, and I think it was Carrie. As a staff person, I want to point out that all state employees, except for the university system, through the governor's budget, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, will receive the 3% increase this year and next year. It was only the university system that wasn't funded on. So for someone in my position is available at a university level, but it's also available at transportation and any of the others. If I, as a university employee, was told I'm not getting a raise for 2 years, but if I walk across the street to another state entity, I could get an increase for 2 years, I think that could be detrimental to our institutions too, because we're all state employees. And so I think we need to applaud our presidents for finding a way to match what the rest of the state employees are going to get.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, if I could just follow up on that. Janice is certainly correct in terms of other state employees. The only thing I want to clarify is that and how the higher ed appropriation got funded in the end, as you know, went through several iterations. But in the end, I think what legislators would tell you on appropriations is they did fund a 3% salary increase in the higher ed budget. So I think, you know, there would probably be some legislative concern if we did something different than that, because, you know, they would tell you they believe they actually funded it. But again, as we saw that bottom line, you know, if you still end up net negative, it's, you know, what didn't they fund is the proverbial question. I don't know how you answer that.
Mr. Chairman, if I can just add on to what Laura's saying and to Ms. Hoffert's point, admittedly, from the last legislative session and going into this legislative session, there were conflicting interpretations about how the funding model was supposed to work. And so last session, what happened is institutions received student credit hour production in dollars at a set rate for each of the tiers of the institutions, and then the governor recommended and the legislature appropriated then 3% salary increases over that. But the conversation during the interim that we had at many of the interim committees with legislators is, well, what are we funding with the student credit hour production? And so when we went into this legislative session, we were under the old assumption that we would get the student credit hour production funded, and then there would be funding for the salary increases on top of that, and that was the governor's recommendation. But once it got into the legislature, then they asked that same question again. Well, what are we funding with that student credit hour production? And so to Laura's point, they would tell you that they funded the salary increases. And particularly when it got in the Senate and they added, first they added a 2% inflation factor, And then in conference committee, that was set at a 1.5% inflation factor. So all the institutions were funded for student credit hour production plus a 1.5% inflation factor. And the argument is that that funded then the cost to continue, the state share of the cost to continue. So I agree with Laura. We don't want to say it wasn't funded. The student credit hour production was funded, but we had variance in interpretation of the funding model based on our experience last legislative session and the governor's recommendation this session. But we know now where we are at the end of the session, and the legislature then is very firm in saying that the cost to continue is funded by the student credit hour production.
Before we close out on the subject, Kathy raises a good point. We just can't always do everything on the backs of the students. In reference to Carrie, when it comes to new initiatives, sometimes as organizations, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, if you want to do something new, you have to see what should we quit doing. And I think sometimes all organizations can probably do a better job of that. So rather than having a new initiative that's funded by the students, maybe sometimes we have to look at what we should quit doing at that particular campus or within the system. And that takes some rigor too.
Okay. Echoing off that, and I agree with both of you on that, especially coming from the student perspective, having a pretty substantial debt load myself. Regarding a lot of these student services, and I'm looking at the Wilson state increase, not to pick on Wilson's. I know Wilson's going through a very difficult time right now, so the last thing I want to do is pile on that, and I understand why there's, for some reason it shows a 117% increase. I got 66% increase when I actually calculated it out, but a very substantial increase over the statutory limit of 1% before the increase. I mean, I'm actually even a little concerned in terms of the precedent that would set, and what kind of message that sends to the public and the state legislature. I still back it. I understand why it needs to happen, but that concern is there, and especially with the increase in the state's share this past biennium for most institutions as well.
Just kind of a quick question on that. So when we talk about cost to continue, and you said, we have the split, are we basically saying that in the aggregate, the cost to continue remains that even after you take into account increases in fees and room and board, it's still at that, the 60-40 or whatever? So it's the total number, the total cost to students. So as we take that, we're still tracking the numbers, the targets that are set there. We're not saying just tuition or just, okay.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, when we talk about the state student shares, and let me just give you an example, at the two-year campuses, that state student share is 75% from the state, 25% from the student. That 25% we're talking about from the student is strictly tuition. So we're funding that cost, that student share of that cost to continue only from the tuition rate increase. Fees and room and board are being used to support either the auxiliaries, residence hall, the food service, or the student activities, the intramurals, student government, those kinds of things. Now, to your last point about are we tracking the targets, none of our institutions are at the state student share where they're supposed to be. So where the two-year campuses are supposed to be 75-25, some of them are probably 50-50, 50% from the state funded and 50% from the students. So we've got a long way to go. I mean, it took us a long way to get there. It's going to take us a long way to go to get to those state student share targets. So while we're using those as the guide in this modeling, we haven't yet reached those targets.
But those are total cost targets, not just tuition. I mean, it does include.
Well, let's say, for example, as an institution, my cost to continue is $100,000. We would say at the two-year campuses, 75% of that should be picked up by the state. So $75,000 comes from the state, $25,000 should come from the student through tuition rate increases. And then we figure out how much of a tuition rate increase is needed to generate that $25,000 slice.
Any other comments or questions? Laura?
Just another brief question. Yeah, question. So we've had a lot of increases in terms of overall the state share. Some universities did hit pretty hard, but a lot of them did hit a state increase in share. But there still was a lot of shortfall. Was that in general expected shortfall from the state, or? I'm sorry, to re-ask my question. Some states had an increase in their state share, but there was still relatively close to the 2.5% increase, if not the 2.5% increase.
Mm-hmm.
What was the general impact in terms of legislative session, in terms of what they got from the state legislature, in terms of what they were able to fund?
Help me go on a little bit more. I'm trying to, I want to answer your question directly, and I'm not sure
Sure.
I got it.
Well, I guess I'm just trying to keep in mind in terms of student affordability, I guess, to keep it more holistic. Because, like, again, that's a very big concern of mine and a lot of people I talk to in terms of that. And, you know, seeing these, I saw, like, based on what I'm reading, pretty substantial state share increase, but still tuition increase for every institution. You know, it just in general, I'm just wondering what's being done in terms of more cost control.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I guess I'd have to look to the folks sitting behind me. And I think specifically you're asking about those campuses that had an actual net increase in state funding.
Correct, yep.
And then also didn't need the 2.5% tuition rate increase. So really, we have three institutions, I think, who fall into that category largely. It would be BSC, Lake Region, and NDSU, and those presidents might be in a better position to talk about, you know, what they intend to use those monies for, and how they might be using those to help control student costs. Is that your question?
Yep.
Yeah.
And it's fine, that this needs to answer, this doesn't even necessarily be answered here right now. I just was looking for a general answer. I can ask individually later.
Well, and I think the other thing that will be helpful is when we get through this annual budget process, you know, certainly one of the things you're delegating the authority of the approval of the annual budgets to the chancellor, so we can get that done by June. But certainly we would want to follow up with you and give you some indication of what campuses did in that annual budget planning. And so that's one of the things we could focus on. You know, what did, to your point and Mr. Morton's point, what other things did the institution do to cut costs or reallocate or control costs? And we can certainly do that and follow up once we see the detail.
Okay, perfect. I'll be sure to do that. Thank you.
Okay.
And Dr. Jalmstead, if I may, Dr. Jalmstead,
Yep.
if I may to answer Mr. McEwen's question. So those three institutions are not going to 2.5 when you talk about controlling costs. So two institutions will go to 1.9. So they're not going to the cap. So when, you know, in public education, as Laura's already said, we have decided that there's a state share and there's a student share. And so to make that student share at those institutions that got more state share, the tuition's not going to go to 2.5. It'll go to 1.9 or 2.4.
Okay. Cool.
So that's part of controlling the costs, I guess.
All right, I appreciate it.
Okay, Don, you
We
want
do have a proposed motion on page 5, approve the fiscal year 16 annual budget guidelines, including 2015 and 2016 tuition rates and Williston State College fee increase, and including delegating to the Chancellor authority to approve the annual budgets within the guidelines set forth by the State Board of Higher Ed. We have a motion?
So move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion from Kevin and a second from Gary. Any further discussion? Okay, Christie, call the roll.
Dr. Melliker,
Yes.
Mr. Morton,
Yes.
Mr. Shaft,
Shaft votes yes.
Mr. McEwen,
Yes.
Mr. Ness,
Yes.
Ms. Nesset,
No.
Ms. Reichert,
Yes.
Board Chair Jelmstead.
Yes. Okay, Laura?
Mr. Chairman, I think I have all the other items on the agenda except the next one. I'm not sure who's covering the next one. Joint powers on the Aquatics Center?
Okay, Cynthia?
Is this on okay? All right. I'm not sure. I was good?
Yep.
Okay. Mr. President and members of the board, you have before you a second amendment to a joint powers agreement. It involves the Aquatics Center on the campus of BSC in Bismarck. The facility was constructed between at least two entities, the Bismarck Parks and Rec Department and the State Board of Higher Ed and BSC. And over the course of time, since the original construction and the management of it, which is by Bismarck Parks and Rec, there's been discussion about modifying slightly the process for input into the day-to-day management, operations, and scheduling of the facility. And pursuant to the joint powers agreement, those discussions in order to make those scheduling decisions is set out in the joint power agreement in one way. However, what you have before you is an amendment proposing to modify the way that input is obtained. Parks and Rec will instead meet with designated individuals from the campus and from the various constituents who use the facility and obtain that information and make decisions accordingly. You will also see that Bismarck Parks and Rec has had the opportunity to review the Second Amendment and has approved it and has had their officers sign it. And that's it in a nutshell. If there are any questions?
Any questions of Cynthia?
Okay.
We need a motion, Cynthia, on that?
Yes, we do.
It's on page 24. The motion is to approve the proposed changes to the joint powers agreement dated April 15, 2008, set out in the Second Amendment of the GPA.
Okay. Hey, Chris?
I move to approve the proposed changes to the joint powers agreement updated April 15, 2008, which are set about in the Second Amendment of the joint powers agreement.
Second?
Okay, we have a motion and a second on the joint powers agreement. Any other discussion?
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft votes yes.
Dr. Melliker?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Ms. Nesset?
Yes.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Board Chair Jelmstead?
Yes. Okay, go ahead, Laura.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, agenda item number 6 is on page 25 of your agenda packet. There is a statutorily created state grant advisory board. The state grant is a financial need-based financial aid program that's funded by the state legislature, and this advisory board makes recommendations to you. Today they're bringing to you a recommendation which is outlined in the proposed motion on page 25 in number 2, and that is to increase the annual budget that is used for awarding purposes for this grant program by the amounts shown there. You'll see that there's a different budget amount or cost amount set for the public research universities versus the two-year institutions, and then the tribal and private colleges have a different budget amount. Under the background, you'll see that those budget amounts are each being increased by 2.5%. Obviously, just coming off the discussion we had, tuition in general is going to go up 2.5%, so the budget for financial aid awarding is proposed to go up 2.5%. And then also I want to just point you to the items right after the matrix in the middle of the change, or the matrix in the middle of the page. These aren't items necessarily that require your action today, but they are important changes coming out of the legislative session that are going to have a significant impact on some of our students. And so just to mention them quickly, the positive thing, of course, is that under this program, the legislature did actually increase the funding for this need-based financial aid program by $4.4 million. So for a biennial period, it increased from $21.2 to $25.6 million, and again, we're very appreciative of that. The legislature also changed the award amount Historically, this program, like our other aid programs, are usually only awarded fall and spring terms. This session now, all of our programs will move to year-round awarding. And so this scholarship or grant program was changed essentially from a total maximum over 4 years of $6,600 per student to a total over 4 years now of $7,800 per student. So about a $1,200 increase for students over a 4-year period. I already mentioned the year-round awarding, so we'll be implementing that in our office, which certainly has a large impact on the volume of activity we're going to see, so we're trying to figure out how we manage that increased activity level. The legislature also codified this time our ability to provide also awards to part-time students. We began doing that this biennium, but they've now actually added it to statute. And then the last bullet is probably the most important in the sense of impact. This last session, the legislature changed the rules for who qualifies for this grant program. And essentially what they did is they said, if you don't hold a high school diploma from this state, you don't qualify for this state grant program. So we had a number of students who, as you might expect, moved to the state, may have worked here 2 or 3 years, went back to school. They were eligible, as long as they met the residency requirements, they were eligible for this program, even though they didn't graduate from a North Dakota high school. So now they've basically changed it and said, essentially only high school graduates or those that get a GED in North Dakota qualify for the program. That will likely disqualify about 1,600 of our most needy students right now that have been getting this grant will probably be disqualified from the program in the future. So if you get any phone calls from students wondering, why all of a sudden am I losing my grant, it may be in large part because they were not a North Dakota high school graduate. So I just offer that to you as information, but what we're asking you to approve today is only the budget amounts under the proposed motion on number 2 on page 25.
Okay. Any questions, board members? Is there a motion? Kathy, any question?
My question is just to clarify, so we're not making any change to what the legislature intended on this, or the criteria, we're just approving the budget amounts. Is that right? Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
I do have a comment about this, Mr. Chairman. Is there, and there's no way to change the way the legislation came out, right?
Not until 2 years from now.
Okay. So this should probably be a priority item for 2 years from now, maybe, that we should bring up again and talk about, because it, in my opinion, it really does affect the potential to increase the workforce in North Dakota. So the more opportunities that we have for students to come into our colleges and universities and receive grants and scholarships, the better off our state will be. So in my opinion, it should be a priority to increase that workforce. But if we can't do anything about it now, we can't.
Yep.
So,
Mr. Chairman, if I may, to Dr. Melliker's comments. We did argue that point in all the committees and tried to get that language changed, and obviously it didn't change, and we're not in charge on this issue. And so I think our best evidence, or our best road ahead on this, is to bring the evidence of what the impact of this has been at the end of 2 years. And I know that the legislature would respond to whatever that evidence is. Our evidence is that 1,600 students, needy students, will not now receive the grant, and I think that's going to have a great impact. But that's just our assumption on this thing right now. We don't have the evidence for that, but in 2 years, your new chancellor can carry that evidence in with him when he goes and speaks to those same committees and show them what the impact of this particular legislation was.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
So to that end, Chancellor Scogan and Laura, are we going to be tracking those numbers? Because that's going to be an important piece of information to take into session in 2 years. And and know whether students left the system, whether they left the state, what is the impact for those projected 1,600 students. But not only that, it may also have an impact for recruiting students coming into the institutions over the next several years. And so are we set up to start looking at those numbers and trying to gain that information? So when we go in front of the legislature, we have a logical, well-placed, data-based argument to perhaps change the requirements.
Right, and we've already gotten the preliminary numbers. That's how we came up with the 1,600. So we can identify the students that qualified for grants last year and will not qualify this year. We can already identify them, and we can track them. And to your point, if they've left the system, it's hard probably to track them all the way to a terminus, but at least we can get an aggregate number of how many of those students left the system as a result of it and did not continue to pursue their education. Right now, all we can do is speculate about that, but we can track that, and we can put Vice Chancellor Feldner on that one and to do that tracking.
Janice?
Laura, do we know of the 1,600 students who could potentially lose a scholarship? What criteria are they not fulfilling?
They
did not graduate from a North Dakota high school.
Right. That would be largely it.
So I just have a quick question, Mr. Chairman. Has there been any discussion? I know that this is, I suppose, awaiting signature from the governor and all of that, but has there been any discussion of, because at the same time we're supposed to be maintaining our retention rates, and of course this could potentially jeopardize 1,600 students, and hopefully that the distribution of those students is across all of the institutions. Has there been any discussion of strategies to try to help make up the difference for them within the institution so that they can remain on campus? I mean, I know it's pretty early in the game to be talking about that, but it just strikes me as if they've already made the commitment to come here to North Dakota, and which you and I have talked about this. I don't think it's not a destination. A lot of kids like to go to school in California or somewhere. It's if they're coming to North Dakota, there's a reason they're here. They've made the commitment. They're half. I'd say they've definitely got a foot in the door, and will likely stay. It would be nice to see our institutions try to do something to encourage them to stay. And I don't know what the concessions are, or what the budget impact would be to do that. But assuming these students are in academic, good academic standing, it would be nice. I mean, the amount, it looks like annually, if I'm reading this correctly, it's just shy of a couple $1,000s per student. Is that?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I think it went to $975 a semester. Yeah, it would be, they'd qualify for up to $975 per semester, but again, that depends on what their unmet need is, so that might vary a little bit.
Any other questions? Do we have a motion, Chris?
Yep. I formally move to approve the 2015-2016 tiered budgets as recommended by the Student Financial Advisory Board to be the figures on page 25.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the tiered budgets as recommended. Christie?
Ms. Nassett?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Mr. Nass?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft votes yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Dr. Melliker?
Yes.
Board Chair Jelmstad?
Yes. Okay, then the next item, which is added to the agenda, go ahead, Laura. This is on the funding pool.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you. And I believe Christie has laid a document at each of your places outlining this. The issue under number 1 is transfer of performance funding pool to campuses as prescribed in House Bill 1003. And I apologize for the late addition. As you might imagine, we're scrambling coming out of the session, trying to get things done quickly. And there were a number of pools of funds that the legislature appropriated to the board. And it was kind of our expectation to bring those to you starting in June and thereafter so that we have time to sort them through. But quite honestly, this one's pretty cut and dried, and the reason it's here today is we have at least one of our campuses that needs this money quickly, and that's Williston State. So since it's pretty cut and dried, there isn't a lot of wiggle room for the board, we thought it'd be best just to get your approval. So just in quick summary under the background on number 3, if you'll recall this session, this biennium, the legislature gave us $5 million for performance funding. That was supposed to support a performance funding model, and the dollars were to be allocated to the 11 campuses. Long story short, we got close to the legislative session. That money had not been allocated yet, and so the conservatives side said, well, maybe we should not rush to spend that and go back to the legislature and suggest that either it be retained for performance funding, or if you recall, there was some talk over the course of the biennium to maybe use this money to support projects like PAR, the predictive analytics tool, and those kinds of things. Anyway, long story short, we took the money back to the legislature, said we haven't spent it yet, we'd like to keep it. And they did let us keep it, but instead of it remaining in the performance funding pool, they prescribed that it be distributed to 4 campuses, and those 4 campuses are outlined in the motion. So of the $5 million, $4 million of it would go $1.5 million to Williston, $1.5 million to Dickinson, $0.5 million to Minot, and $0.5 million to Dakota College of Bottineau. As you can see from the mix of campuses, those are largely the campuses that are most significantly impacted by the energy impact in western North Dakota. And so this is to help deal with part of their energy impact. That's only $4 million. The other $1 million the legislature retained, and so of the $5 million we gave back, $4 million will go to those 4 campuses. And again, though that's prescribed in legislation, but the board needs to make the formal distribution. So the motion there would authorize that transfer of funds. And again, you'll see it's subject to the governor signing the appropriation bill because that's not yet been finalized and signed. So we wouldn't make any distributions until we have the governor's final signature.
Do we have a motion to approve the transfer of the $4 million?
So moved.
Moved by Chris. Second?
Second.
Second by Mike. Any comments or questions? Christie?
Ms. Nesset?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft votes yes.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Dr. Meliker?
Yes.
Board Chair Jonestead?
Yes.
I'm just going to
Okay.
stay.
That
Doing good, Laura.
concludes board business. Laura, we're going to switch over to board policy now.
That's me too.
I do
Okay.
have a couple of questions about this. During our chancellor's search, there was, and I can't remember which one of the candidates there was, but there was a concept that basically what he had said during his interview, not during the interview necessarily, but during his application, was that he had worked with some colleges and universities that if they saved that, or they had a team that would go around and help colleges and universities save money through various functions and various ways of doing business, things like that. And so for the amount of money that they would save, the university and college could use that in other areas in their budget. And I think during times like this, that might be appropriate to take a look at a concept maybe similar to that, because I don't know if over the next biennium we're going to have any less issues at Williston State or Dickinson State or some of the other colleges and universities that show significant negative balances as we move into the next couple of years. And along that same line is all of you that work towards developing this budget, and House Bill 1003 did as good of a job as anybody could have done, but there's got to be another way so that every 2 years we don't have this angst and everyone around the table doesn't have the angst. So I don't know what the answer is, but I really think that we need to sit down and talk about that, because it's pretty hard in colleges and universities to think they are going to get this much money and then all of a sudden realize that they're getting significantly less. And secondly, to Mr. Morton's point of view, there is, I think, significant savings as there are in all of our own personal budgets where possibly we could save funding and save funds. And if we could allocate those back to the university and college to use in another area, that might be an incentive for that to move forward.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Melliger.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'm on the policy, first reading policy 803.1, which begins on page 26. This is proposed revisions to the purchasing policy. And again, if we look at the background information on page 26, I'll just quickly try to summarize for you the major changes, because if you looked at the marked up version, there are a lot of markups, and it looks more overwhelming than it is for a couple reasons. But in terms of the background, on page 26, there was a recent follow-up audit done at Dickinson State. As those of you on the audit committee know, once we have an audit, the state auditor's office will typically come in about 18 months later and do a follow-up to see if we've implemented the things we said we were going to do. And that happened at Dickinson, the follow-up audit. And they raised a couple of questions in that audit around purchasing related to definitions, and then also what documentation should be maintained and shouldn't be maintained. So as part of our review of this policy, we address those issues, but we also address some other issues that I'll speak to. In terms of the first bullet under the background, one of the definitional issues that the auditors raised is what's a commodity versus what's a service, because you'll see that we have different bidding thresholds and documentation thresholds depending on whether something's a commodity or a service. So we fine-tuned those definitions, and the one we really tried to be clear about is identified in the bullet, and that is that services means the furnishing of labor, time, and effort by a contractor not involving the delivery of a specific end product other than reports that are incidental. And in large part, this really has to do with printing. Is printing a commodity or a service? So that helps us define that. The second bullet you'll see is there's a matrix that follows at the bottom of page 26 and the top of page 27. And what we did is we further stratified our bidding thresholds for both goods and services. And what that allowed us to do is for smaller purchases, and by smaller, I'm not talking $5. I'm talking less than $10,000, in some cases less than $50,000. But it allowed us to say that for certain lower cost purchases, institutions are not required to formally bid. They can do informal quotes. And secondly, they don't need to maintain every piece of documentation around those formal quotes. And we did that in large part because, as you might imagine, if you're doing something informal, a lot of times then you don't have a formal documentation process, and it kind of defeats the purpose of having an informal process if it all of a sudden becomes formal, and then it just becomes administratively burdensome. So what we tried to do as we sorted through this is we tried to establish more discrete thresholds and then be very specific about when bidding, formal bidding is required and when documentation is required, and that's outlined in the matrix. The other thing we tried to do is we've had ongoing conversation with state government, because we do work cooperatively with state government on purchasing, and they also were looking at increasing some of their bid thresholds, so we did the same here. Then right under the matrix on page 27, as we are going through all of our policies, we are shifting more to a policy governance model. So a lot of the overstrike and underscore is because we're moving things between policy and procedure, from procedure back to policy. So not necessarily removing things, it's just a matter of where we place things. And then the last item, which isn't really part of the policy, but I just make special note of it here because I think we'll be doing more of this, and that is, as part of this policy, at times there are exceptions to the purchasing policy, where you have unique purchases for a certain type of good or service, or you have a single vendor and only one vendor that can provide it. Obviously, we don't go through the whole formal RFP process. We need to document those situations for audit purposes. Some campuses had a form or document to do that, some didn't. So we agreed we were going to develop a common form that all 11 campuses are going to do, so when the auditors come in, there's one standard format for them to look at. And so we've also developed that as part of this overall process, and we'll be placing that out there and available to campuses. What you'll note is under the motion on number 2 on page 26 that we're recommending to you this policy on first reading. Second reading would be typically the end of June, but we're asking for a delayed effective date on this till January 1, 2016. That buys us time to do the appropriate education and training on our campuses and get the tool set in place so that when we go live January 1, 2016, we're fairly confident we'll have compliance. Because if we drop this in place quickly without the appropriate training and education, then we're just more apt to some mistakes in the short term. So that's the reason for the delayed implementation date.
Okay, even though this is a first reading, I think we need a motion to approve the changes to policy 803.1. Is there a motion?
I make a motion to approve the purchasing policy on first reading.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any other questions or comments? Okay, Christie. Okay, Eric?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question on the language that's proposed. For instance, in the for goods from 10,000 but less than 50,000 category, and the same language in services 50,000 but less than 100,000. So it says informal quotes or proposals from more than one vendor should be solicited. So I interpret should be as, well, it's not required. Is the thoughts that it is required, or is it optional?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm not certain which page you're on, but...
Oh, I'm on page 27.
Okay. What we do say is generally when feasible, more than one
It
should be solicited.
The when feasible is used at level 1.
Right.
Then level 2, it says informal quotes or proposals should be.
Yes, then it's mandatory.
And then the next level is mandatory. So the intent of the policy, just to make it clear, the intent of the policy is we're encouraging people to have more than one vendor, but it's not required.
So at the first level, as you suggested, we say when feasible. So that's not mandatory. When we use the word should, that means that they should, they must.
Well, I think you need to, because I interpret it as one vendor should be solicited. Maybe you want to say must be solicited.
And I'm sorry, I apologize. I don't have the detailed language of the policy in front of me,
and I'm
but
only
I'll
reading what's
double-check
here,
that.
Laura.
Sure.
So
I'll make note of that.
And the only thing is the less that's open to interpretation, the better.
Sure.
If the intent is to require at least 2 bids, then that's what it should definitely convey that message. So.
Any other comments? Christie, call the roll.
Ms. Nesset?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Dr. Melliker? Mr. Shaft?
Shaft votes yes.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Board Chair Jelmstad?
Yes. Okay, Laura?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the next policy on first reading is on page 28, and it has to do with background checks for new employee hires. It's a criminal records history background check policy. Again, under the background on number 3, there's a number of reasons we undertook a review of this policy. The first one is that it was actually the Academic Affairs Council came to us and asked us to take a look at consistency and practices for faculty hires. The second item was our current policy and procedure was actually quite confusing to some people, so hopefully we've simplified and clarified that. The third item is that in our recent FY14 financial statement audit, the auditors raised a concern about student employees who had access to confidential information and ensuring that they had criminal history background checks before they had access to that information. So we've addressed that. And then the fourth, actually it was interesting through this process that you'll see in a moment that what we're suggesting here has very little impact, even though we're requiring more criminal background checks on employees. At some campuses, it'll have very little impact because they were already going above and beyond the existing policy. So the other thing we tried to do is standardize this so that all campuses were doing the same thing with regards to their practices. And then, of course, the sixth item, as I said, is we're restructuring this around a policy governance structure. So the substantive changes are outlined in the middle of page 28. First of all, we have a very small group of employees that are required to have an FBI background check. Those, as you know, are finger-based background checks. Those are largely our police officers, and we've also added to that now dispatch or call center operators who work in those offices as well. Those employees would be subject to that FBI check. We're also expanding the criminal history records check to now also mandate that we also at the same time complete a sex offender registry check on all benefited employees. So that's not done consistently now, so now the sex offender registry check is required. Thirdly, we are expanding. So under current policy, all benefited employees are subject to a background check. Not all non-benefited employees are. We are adding some additional non-benefited employees who would be subject to a background check. Those are noted in bold italics. So any employee who has access to confidential or proprietary information would be subject to a check. So back to the auditor's concern, if we hire student employees and they're working in the PeopleSoft system and have access to student records, they would have to have a background check at the time of hire. The other major change we're making for non-benefited employees is now all faculty, regardless of whether they're benefited or non-benefited, would be subject to a background check. Non-benefited would typically be what we call adjunct faculty. So adjunct faculty now would be subject to a background check, including the graduate teaching assistants. We also developed guidance about people who are rehired, promoted, or transferred between institutions. There was always a question about, well, you know, what if somebody quits and comes back 9 months later? Do we have to do a background check? So we've prescribed those details in the policy now so that every campus is treating those in the same manner. And then the other thing we've done, though, is one of the concerns, especially as we extended this requirement to adjunct faculty, is many times we have to hire adjunct faculty on very short notice. We get into the fall term, enrollment's up, we need to add class sections, we need to hire adjunct faculty now. And so there was concern about, well, if we have to wait for the background check to come back before they can start teaching, that's problematic. So we've added an exception that allows employees to start before the background check is complete, as long as they're under proper supervision, and then obviously they would be subject to dismissal immediately if the background check came back with something that's of concern. So we built in that safeguard so that campus, this isn't going to slow down getting instructors and other folks in the door that we need. On page 29, we did our best to try to estimate the financial implication of expanding the number of employees that'll be subject to a check. Keep in mind that background checks range anywhere from $45 to $75 per employee, depending on what we're checking on. But we've outlined in the matrix that system-wide we'll probably have about close to 1,400 more checks we'll need to do per year. The annual cost of that's about $70,000. You'll see that half of those will be at UND. And then the other thing I should note is that, again, as part of this process, we did talk with the Human Resource Council, and we're just in the process of releasing a request for proposal now to see if we can identify a single vendor at the system level to do all of our background checks. Right now, you know, different campuses are using different vendors. We thought we might have more consistency and better pricing if we do a single award, if that ends up making sense. And so we're going to be hitting the streets with that RFP shortly, and we'll see when we get the responses back whether or not that makes sense.
Janice?
Laura, tell me if I'm reading this wrong, but it says that this now expands the provisions to require for non-benefited position, including volunteers who, and then you go down a couple of points, have access to cash, credit, debit, or other financial transactions. I'm thinking specifically of those student employees who work 5 hours a week in dining services. They now have to pass a background check before they can be employed?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, yes, if they have access to cash, they have to have a pre-employment background check. And actually, that provision is in current board policy. So it's only the bold italics that is new. The other provisions are already part of the background check policy.
So I'm thinking of, in my instance, I probably hire 10 young people a year to work concerts. Some of them might work 2 concerts, some of them might work 10 concerts, some might work 100 concerts. I'm going to pay more for their background check than they're going to earn in wages. And they're in a limited amount of cash. I'm just wondering about if we should be looking at if they deal with money at a certain level, because we're talking a huge expense for some of these institutions for a small amount of money.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, good point, and 2 things that we discussed. One is that certainly this is going to have implications about different hiring decisions that campuses make. So, you know, instead of hiring 10, you might say, I'm only going to hire 2, and you're going to have to work more of those concerts because of the implication of this. I mean, and we realize that there are those kinds of decisions that are going to have to be made. We actually started out this policy with trying to create the exception list. So, you know, really, do we need to make everybody do it? How about we start saying, here's who we're accepting? It became way too long and too confusing. And quite honestly, we finally ended up saying that that's just too much of a compliance risk and a liability risk, that it's just, you know, we actually end up in one point in the discussion, just somebody said, let's just do them for everybody. You know, absolutely everybody. That way we don't have to worry about who we're missing, and, you know, we don't have any audit issues. That was a little extreme. You know, we're probably not quite there, but I think what we end up with is in a situation where we start trying to carve out groups of people, like, well, in this group, these people have to have it, but these don't. It just becomes way too difficult to administer.
From my experience, I know from a optometric point of view, when optometry students go into the VA Medical Center just to observe patients, they also need background checks as well, fingerprinting and everything. So if this type of concept will save a student from having a sexual attack or having some sort of other incident that could be detrimental to the student and could prevent some of the few amount of incidents that we have had in our university system, I think it's very important to do it. And the small amount, and I consider the amount of money that it takes to do that very small. And I agree with you, Laura. I think probably less people would be hired. It might be easier once we get through the system, but to me, it's very critical to have a concept like this. And the more difficult it is, the more stringent it is. I'm all in favor of that.
Eric?
Yes, thank you. My question is, oftentimes the line between GTA and GRA is very blurry. Okay, we have a lot of GRAs who some departments, certainly our department has in the past required a fair bit of teaching experience, even though they're on a graduate research assistantship as opposed to a graduate teaching assistantship. So my question is, because of that line is blurry, but also many of those students, certainly in the sciences, have access to controlled substances, depending on what is being done in laboratory, drugs, explosives, or other potentially dangerous chemicals and substances. So what I'm wondering about is the wisdom of just saying GTAs versus GTAs and GRAs, because the reality is those are blurred. And so we're going to, you know, it would be, if the intent is to do the background check because of responding to concerns, then I question whether we should have both defined in the policy, and I think that's an important consideration.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, you're correct in that the thought process was that some of the GRAs would be subject to a criminal background check because they may meet some of those other mandatory requirements. They may have master keys. They may be subject to confidential information. So we probably will pick up some of them if they meet those other criteria, but not necessarily all of them. Unlike the GTAs, where we're saying that if we're really going to make all faculty, both benefited and non-benefited faculty, subject to the check, that teaching assistants certainly aren't any different in their capacity. And then the GRAs we would pick up in those other areas to the extent where it's important we do that. We could certainly take a look at and go back and look at adding all GRAs as well, but quite honestly, there's still a little bit of concern about mandating that all GTAs have it. So you know, this was kind of a compromise position as well.
Well, and the reality is the majority of these costs are borne by the two research institutions.
Right.
And UND, it's, like you said, roughly about half the anticipated increase. But if the intent is to ensure that people who are teaching undergraduate students have the adequate background checks, you know, unfortunately, as I mentioned, those lines are blurred, and I frankly don't know if our current students undergo any kind of background check who are in the laboratories. I really can't tell you whether they do or not. So you know, I don't know what occurs currently, but certainly if the intent is to ensure that the background is done, then you know, I think you really need to revisit the GRA issue.
So, Mr. Chairman, this does come to you after review by review and support from Human Resources, Academic Affairs, Student Affairs, Administrative Affairs, Chancellor's Cabinet, Budget Finance Committee. So the motion before you is on page 28, number 1, again, to move this forward on first reading, and then assuming second reading in June, we would ask for an effective implementation date of July 1, the beginning of the fiscal year.
Comment, Kathy?
Nope. I move first reading.
Okay. This is only a first reading, but we need a motion to approve the recommended changes to policy 602.3. Do you have a motion?
Second.
Second by Chris.
Who wouldn't be covered by this? I mean, I'm just trying to come up with, because I mean, you know, to Kevin's point, I mean, employers can be held liable for the acts of their employees, and you know, if we put if we should have known that they have some background of some kind, and so I'm just kind of curious who's left out of this.
So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, all benefited employees are required to go through one. So it's only non-benefited. So non-benefited employees that do not meet the bullets in the middle of page 28.
So, but I mean, just by way of example,
I mean. So, for example, maybe we have somebody who works at athletic events but has no master keys and no access to cash. They guide people to their seats, for example. Or it could be students who work in an auxiliary but again, are not a resident hall manager, don't have master keys, don't have access to cash. You know, just by the nature of their job, they don't have access to those kinds of things. So what we're trying to ensure is that those employees that potentially have one-on-one access with students and/or have access to cash or controlled substances, that's the group of employees we really want to focus the background checks on.
And the reason I just asked that is I know for us, absolutely everybody, interns, everyone who comes on site gets background check, drug screen, and part of that is if they commit some sort of wrongful act, I mean, we could be on the hook. So we are leaving open some risk by not saying it's across the board, and I just want to make sure that we know we're doing that.
Yeah, we are, and in fact, like I said, we talked about, hey, maybe we just do everyone. It's easier to administer, and you're right, you do reduce your risk then.
Okay, if there are no further comments, Christie, call the roll.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft votes yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Ms. Nesset?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Dr. Meliker?
Yes.
Board Chair Jelmstad?
Yes. Hey, Laura, you have the second readings?
I do. Second reading, number 9, the moving expenses. I guess since they're second reading, I don't know if we want to go through each of them. I know we did at the last meeting.
I'd recommend we go through if there's any changes
Okay.
since first reading to
Yeah.
second reading, because we're going to start losing people here in a few
Mr.
minutes.
Chairman, members of the committee, there's no changes to 806.3 on moving, no changes on 820.1 employee tuition waivers. I look at Murray, is there a change? Nothing on alcoholic beverages. I do believe we will propose a change to you, though, on 907, number 12. So I don't know if you want to take the other 3 first.
So move.
Mr. Soxy, in just a second, are there changes on policy dealing with alcohol? None? Okay. We have a motion to accept those 3
Second.
and a second. Any comments? Okay, Christie, call the roll.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft votes yes.
Ms. Nesset?
Yes.
Mr. McEwen? Yes. Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Dr. Meliker?
Yes.
Board Chair Jelmstad?
Yes.
And Mr. Chairman, members of the board, on number 12, I'd turn the floor over to Mr. Shaft. I believe he has some suggested change he would like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the board, as you see, the policy before you is fairly straightforward regarding the Slack issue. What I wanted to point out is under paragraph 1, you will see the final sentence indicates projects acquired or constructed prior to January 1, 2012 are exempt from this policy. Mr. Condor and I have worked closely on this since the time of first reading. We weren't absolutely sure that the 2012 date would cover the gap that we were trying to deal with. So we felt more comfortable if we backed that date up to January 1, 2000. Although it might only add a small handful of bills to even that, we felt comfortable by bumping that from 2012 to 2000. We would then cover everything that we were intending. So the proposed amendment to 907 from the time of the first reading would be to change the date of 2012 under paragraph 1 to 2000, and that's it.
Any comments or questions? If there are none, is there a motion to approve the policy with the change in date?
So move.
Moved by Kevin,
Yes.
Second.
second by Kathy. Any other comments? Christie, call the roll.
Dr. Meliker?
Yes.
Ms. Reichert?
Yes.
Mr. Ness?
Yes.
Mr. Morton?
Yes.
Mr. McEwen?
Yes.
Ms. Nesset?
Yes.
Mr. Shaft?
Shaft votes yes.
Board Chair Jelmstad?
Yes. Okay, moving down to the policies. Policy 302.2, the audit committee. Who's going to report? Murray?
Chairman, members of the committee, what I've done is listed a number of policies that are moving up on the queue now, and there are no drafts or any specific recommendations. But what I've done is preliminarily have gone through the legislation that was enacted this session and listed policies that likely may need some revision because of the legislative changes. For example, 302.2 on the Audit Committee and on 802.8 below in the Internal Audit Charter, there may be some changes needed because of the removal of funding for the internal auditors, and the funding that's left now is $300,000 for an internal audit pool. So that could affect how the Audit Committee and these two policies are. 340.2, that has been on there for a while. Every month that goes by, I have a different epiphany or insight about the particular foundations, and I have a draft that you will have before I darken your doors or leave, and that is a promise. Workforce training boards, there is legislation in House Bill 1003 that addresses workforce training, and that it may affect that particular policy. Policy 514 is due process requirements. There's a bill, Senate Bill 2150, that has significant due process requirements that will require amendments to Policy 514, and staff are working on that virtually every day since it was enacted. Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs is working on Policy 605.1, Academic Freedom and Tenure. Legal Representation 607.2, that will be a requirement that will be changed because all of the attorneys in the university system are being transferred to the Attorney General's office effective July 1, and so that will be changed. Employee responsibility and activities, fraud, theft, fraud, abuse, and waste. I am reviewing that for updating and will be making a recommendation to the board. Early retirement, there's legislation that affects early retirement, so that will be reviewed to ensure that we're in compliance with that legislation. And Section 400 and 500 are under review. All of those policies and those sections are under review by the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. So there's a lot going on right now.
Any questions of Marie?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Soxveen. That takes us to the end of the policies under review. And at this time, we come to the end of our agenda. We have time for public comments. Anybody in the audience have a public comment? Dr. Shirley?
Chairman Jelmstead, members of the board, just a very quick update. As you know, for the record, Steve Shirley, President at Minot State. As you know, after a 40-year career at Dakota College Bottineau, Ken Gross announced last week his retirement. Dr. Gross had to leave and head back to Bottineau. So we'll have a little more time with Ken here over the next couple of months as he begins to transition out of that role and move into retirement. But just so you are aware, we are beginning the process now to move forward and seek a replacement for the campus dean position at Dakota College Bottineau. I'll be up there tomorrow for commencement. Ken and I have been working on putting in place the search committee with campus and community people from Bottineau, and so that is taking shape, and we've got the working on the position description. We'll get that posted soon and begin the search process soon. Ken has agreed to remain in the position So we won't be finding an interim, for example, but he will be moving into retirement later this summer, and hopefully with a successful search, we'll have a new campus dean in place in the not-too-distant future. So just wanted to provide a quick update on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shirley. Any other presidents have a comment? I see Dr. Mason, you have a report. Any comment on your report? Nothing? Okay.
Dr. Jelmstead, if I
Dr.
may,
Yes.
as long as you mentioned Dr. Mason, we will probably at the June 24th meeting, there's going to be a very short meeting in the morning in Fargo. We'll probably be discussing the October 1 date. We've got down that was going to be held at Dickinson State. At that time, you will be selecting the next president of Dickinson State. Ms. Riker is the chair of that committee, and Dr. Mason's inauguration is actually scheduled for October 1st. So we're not going to want to interfere with that, so we're going to be moving the board meeting to either a day or two before the October 1st date or a day or two after it, and we'll be working with Ms. Riker to get a date that works for her committee for that.
Any other comments? I would like to recognize Dr. Hageroth, who is with us today. He's sitting in and getting lots of, I don't know what you're getting, Doctor.
I hope he got smarter.
But we appreciate you being here, yeah. Yeah, smarter is not the word. Let's give him a big hand. Dr. Haggard, want to comment at all?
So thank you for
Well, thank you for being here. We appreciate it. Anything else for the good of the order? Eric?
Yeah, there's something I've been contemplating since February, and it really concerns sort of this legislative session and some of the actions that's been taken, and where the legislative authority begins and the constitutional authority of the board begins, and whether lines have been blurred. And certainly, you know, this is a constitutional board, and it has defined authority within the Constitution of the State of North Dakota, and certainly things have changed since that was brought about in the late 30s. And so, you know, what I'm wondering is some of the actions to remove, for instance, the auditors as well as the attorneys from the authority of the board. Whether that interferes with our constitutional mandate to operate and to be the fiduciary body for the North Dakota University system. And I think this is an important discussion point I think we all need to reflect on and think about, because you know, I understand the legislature's authority to give us the money from the state to provide for that, the state's share of the system's budget. But some of these other things, I question whether they're treading over into interfering with our constitutional rights and that have been granted by the Constitution. And I don't know what, I'm not a constitutional attorney, I'm not a lawyer at all, but this seems to has bothered me for quite some time, and I think now that the session's done, we sort of see where things have gone. I think it's time to reflect and perhaps get some commentary from some experts in the field of whether this board's authority has been somewhat attenuated by these actions, and whether that's constitutionally or violates our constitutional authority. And so overall, you know, I was very concerned as we move through this time, and I'm very concerned about the board maintaining that integrity that the Constitution gives us, but also maintaining that responsibility. And certainly in today's modern world with compliance with federal mandates, I think we heard at the AGB meeting somewhere around 10% of budgets are being spent on compliance, federal compliance issues. Having attorneys who are acutely aware of this and how these processes occur, and they are absolutely critical, as well as the internal audit function. So I want people to reflect on that. I don't know if anybody else cares to comment, but it's been a concern and a growing concern. Thank you.
Appreciate your comments, Dr. Murphy. Anybody have a comment?
Dr. Jelm, just one clarification on what Dr. Murphy said. The legislature did not remove the board's authority to have auditors. The House removed it, the Senate put it back in. What was removed was the funding for those audit positions. So the board still has the authority to have internal audits because, as it turned out, the state auditor cannot conduct internal audits, but that authority continues.
Thank you for that correction. But as I recall, it's $300,000 been allocated for that, which, again, the question will be whether that'll be enough to actually do the job. But certainly, that's not sufficient to continue the course that we were on.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. Anybody, any other comments? Mike?
I think we all have the same concerns, and I would like to find ways to work with our legislature, and I think that should be on the agenda for our June meeting, to find out some ways that we can work with our legislators.
Good idea. I think that's a great topic for our retreat. Any other comments? I declare this meeting adjourned.